We're excited today to celebrate the publication of a new book. It's been a deeply collaborative effort between Professor Ken Stiles and a number of students that have been involved in this project for many years, and we get to celebrate that today and learn a little international relations along the way. My name is Quinn Meekum. I direct the academic programs here at the Kennedy Center, and we're pleased to host this event today. Before I introduce our panel and presenters, I'd like to have an opening prayer. Elijah Moon, who is from Salem, Oregon, and a student of history, will offer that invocation. Thank you, Elijah.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be able to come here and to be able to open our hearts to thy Spirit, that we may be able to be taught, and that the knowledge which is dispensed here may be able to help us in our mission to bring peace and to be peacemakers, and to avoid the conflict and contention of the devil. And Father, we pray that we may be able to serve those around us, and we are so grateful for this university and the opportunity to be able to come here and grow in knowledge. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you very much. For those of you who may not be aware, this semester the Kennedy Center's lecture series is on the topic of building and brokering peace every Wednesday at noon, and occasionally also on a Friday. We bring in great speakers who are addressing topics from a wide variety of disciplines on the subject of building and brokering peace. And this coming Wednesday at noon, we're pleased to hear from Patrick Mason. Patrick Mason is the chair of Mormon Studies at Utah State University, and he'll be speaking on his new book, co-authored with David Pulsifer, called Proclaim Peace, which is a book that tries to articulate an LDS theology of peace and conflict. So you're all invited to that. That's this coming Wednesday at noon. I'm pleased to welcome Ken Stiles to the Kennedy Center. He's not a stranger to the Kennedy Center. He's spent a lot of time here and is one of our wonderful scholars of international relations. Professor Stiles is a professor of political science here. He teaches courses in international organization, international law, ethics as well, in international relations. He is really a prolific scholar and has done a lot of interesting work on a wide range of topics in international relations, but he's quite interested in the role of powerful states in creating and enforcing global institutions and rules. His two recent books that just came out a year and a half ago are The Domestic Sources of International Institutions, Routledge 2023, and The Global Institutions in a Time of Power Transition, Edward Elgar 2023, which will be the topic of the presentation today. I also want to acknowledge that we have some of our great students presenting today. So in addition to Professor Stiles, Rachel Hawks, Savannah Leavitt, Paige Murphy, and Rebecca Lines will all be participating in this presentation. We are going to go until 1:50 today. The presentations will finish up before that, at which time we will invite our panelists to come up to the front where you can ask them questions and engage in dialogue. Please join me in welcoming Ken Stiles, as well as Rachel, Savannah, Paige, and Rebecca to the Kennedy Center.
Thanks very much, Professor Meekum, and thanks for creating this platform. This has been a project about 5, maybe 6 years in the making, and I'm very grateful for the many students who've participated. More about that later. So when you write a book, first question that you have to come up with is, what's different about how the world is evolving And the key thing is the idea that there have always been very, very powerful actors. Sometimes they were called empires, kingdoms. Now they tend to be republics. And they've dominated whole regions, sometimes whole continents. I first of all started by looking at a list of how many of these there have been, about 100 or so that qualify. But almost all of them have declined and sort of left the center stage. At this point, we still have a couple. But I was interested in what happens when that occurs. In most cases, the countries just sort of fade away. In others, they collapse and disintegrate. But in a few cases, about 24, they are replaced by another major power that is just as dominant and just as assertive over the other countries in their regions. And this we call a power transition. Conventional wisdom says that power transitions are extremely dangerous moments in world history. This is when you run the risk of a global war that takes out millions and millions of people and completely upends the rules of the road, the laws, institutions that were set up, especially when you have what they call a radical revisionist country come along. Maybe, is what I have to say about that. Because if you actually look at all of these power transitions, as I've identified them, it looks different than what the conventional wisdom says. And that's partly because conventional wisdom is focused on Europe, has focused on the last 400 or 500 years, and has also included power transitions that didn't actually transpire. Attempted power transitions, I call those. But if you look at all of the power transitions going all the way back to antiquity, which I think is a valid thing to do, it turns out that only in about 1 out of 5 cases do you have massive violence and upheaval. And only about 1 of 5 cases do you have dramatic disruption in the way things are done. That means in about 4 out of 5 cases of power transition, things actually move with a moderate level of violence. You'll still see battles, but they'll be in remote places or at sea, and you'll end up with a world that looks very similar to the world before the transition. Those are some failed transitions. You see Napoleon in the one picture, of course Hitler in the other. But there are a lot more successful transitions. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are many successful transitions where you do have this continuity with a moderate to low level of violence. Why is that? Well, a lot of people studying power transitions are starting to spend more and more time looking at the internal dynamics of the countries involved rather than the global structure. And they're all finding some of the same things that I found, which is that a lot depends on the relationship between the rising power and the declining power before the transition. Turns out most of these very powerful states established large institutional arrangements with provinces that were semi-autonomous and vassal states that were just expected to provide taxes or soldiers when needed, and allies that were even more independent. But we're all sort of networked into a system that tried to provide something for everybody. And that makes a big difference when a country that is part of that system becomes more powerful. Its first inclination seems to be to preserve that system. It also ties into a pragmatic question of trying to keep everybody else in the system satisfied, because chances are usually high that if the system exists for any length of time, it must be serving some purpose. The other thing is that the elites, the leaders, the monarch, the royals, the bureaucrats, the generals in the rising power are often very sympathetic to the elites in the declining power. Perhaps they went to the same schools or fought battles side by side, or maybe even worked in the palace administration, or maybe even intermarried, belonged to the same religions, all sorts of different things that connect people. And they are also predisposed to preserve the system and not to completely eliminate it. So in general, where you see that kind of arrangement, that kind of interpersonal relationship, that kind of political institution, you can expect the transition to be relatively peaceful, again, not entirely peaceful, and relatively continuous, where the arrangements carry on. So how do we figure this out? Well, thanks to a generous grant from the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and financial and, frankly, emotional support from the political science department and my colleagues, I was able to recruit students, very capable students. Here are some names. In fact, let me go ahead and show you their adorable pictures. There you go, and that's being recorded, so there it is. That's on a permanent record. And together, we divvied up the work. I did about 7 or 8 cases on my own, but all the others, 15 or so cases, were handled by students. Some of them did the entire case start to finish. Others handed it off to each other. Some collaborated. It was really a remarkable thing. It was a lot of fun to watch. And the end result is a book that is about 500 pages long, coming out in a week or so. I'm very grateful that we found a publisher who was willing to publish the whole entire project. Most of them wanted us to cut it in half, but I said, I don't think so. Didn't want that to happen. So it'll be coming out on as an ebook soon, and as a hard copy after that. It's called Supplanting Empires. Look it up. Anyway, here are some sort of a snapshot of some of the findings here. These are the cases, at least half of them, and you can see on the far right that in most cases, the model that we explored worked fairly well in predicting whether there was going to be a high level of violence or a high level of continuity. Here's the next slide that you can just kind of glance over. I've recrafted all of this into an article-length paper that has been just submitted today, as a matter of fact, or no, yesterday, as a matter of fact, that you can also go to once it's published. So to sum up, in about 17 out of the 22 transitions that we looked at, there was low or moderate violence. In about 19 of the 22 cases, there was considerable continuity in the system. And in most cases, 18 out of 22, this can be attributed to the factors that we considered. We'll now go to some specific cases, and I turn the time to Rachel Hawks.
Hello, I'm Rachel Hawks, a recent graduate of BYU. I'm currently waiting to hear back from grad schools, which is exciting. And I had the pleasure to work on the Parthia-Sasanian transition. These are Persian empires, so that's kind of the space in the world you should be picturing right about now. Some key factors to tie into the theory, what we're looking at, that I want to point out on this slide are that the elites in the Parthian Empire are a combination of noble families, vassal kings, and then the priests of the Zoroastrian religion. They kind of split bureaucracy and ruling 50-50 between those two groups. And those play an important role in the transition that we will see. Prior to the transition, there's about 20 years of succession crisis. They did not have patrilineal succession that was super neat and orderly, so they had civil wars pretty constantly in the Parthian Empire. Immediately preceding the transition, there's a 3-year war with Rome, and a plague that spread, debilitating the population and the army especially. And these are all going to weaken the Parthian Empire, so it's already in decline before the Sasanians begin their revolt. The transition itself begins in 220 AD. Ardashir is a vassal king of the Parthian Empire. His family had been vassals for a couple of generations, so they were well integrated socially into the empire. Many of those noble families that were involved in the previous bureaucracy and ruling of the Parthian Empire fled to ally themselves with Ardashir. They saw a stronger, more likely candidate for a future king. And also the majority of the clergy allied with Ardashir. He was foretold through some priests to be the savior of the religion, to bring orthodoxy back, because there was some mixing with Hellenism that priests had not been liking for the last century or two. He begins his campaign in 220 by claiming independence from Parthia. Within 4 years, he's fought 3 major battles. He's taken the capital city. The previous king is killed, his son is killed, and he's minting coins. So there's a pretty quick turnover between the previous empire and the Sasanians. And within 10 years, all significant male potential heirs of the Arsacids or the Parthians are dead. So a pretty quick transition. There is moderate levels of violence, which doesn't fit with the theory amazingly, but the transition with the elites especially shows that there's going to be a lot of social crossover between the two empires. So Sasanians post-transition, again, you have vassal kings and governors ruling a lot of things. The priests are more involved in the political bureaucracy and carrying out of daily state affairs this time, which had been their hope previously, and that came true. It was the same noble families as before. Surans and Karens were 2 of the most prominent families. They ran the military for hundreds of years in the Parthian Empire, and they did the same in the Sasanians, which shows that the crossover of elites is really important to the social and political continuity between a transition. And also, their main enemy is Rome. It has been for about 700 years for the Persians. It remains so for the next 300 to 400 years through the Sasanian Empire. Their favorite territory to fight over is Armenia. There's lots of gold there. I'm sure you didn't know that. But a lot of things remain the same. The military has kind of the same tactics, similar styles. Socially, there's the same religion, the same elites. It's very continuous, which means that our theory fit in our analysis is moderate, that they're so similar in political structure, elite makeup. The rising power was a vassal state, so it was socialized into the empire beforehand. And just that level of violence is what makes it not a perfect fit for a theory, but a very good fit. So that's the Parthian-Sasanian transition.
Hi, I'm Savannah. I'm really excited to be here at the end of this awesome project. I did the Rashidun Umayyad transition. Lasted from the transition itself was around 661. Rashidun started. There we go. Rashidun started around 632. The Umayyads fell around 750 AD. So I kind of like this map. Here we have the extent of Muhammad's empire, kind of just in the peninsula right here, to the Rashidun, and then to the Umayyads, kind of the furthest extent you see right here. The Rashidun did come from the deep desert. The peninsula was kind of straddled on either side by 2 hegemons. You had the Sasanians to the east, and then the Byzantine Romans to the west. And it was a really huge military feat for the Muslims to come and take over these 2 really big hegemons. But at the same time, the Muslims did not have their own administration system to impose, because they were coming from an entirely tribal social fabric in the peninsula. Right. Does that work? Yeah. So some of the continuity we see included tribal favoritism. The Umayyads demonstrated a lot of tribal favoritism in official appointments, like the Sasanians and the pre-Islamic kind of social fabric before them. Later on, we do see some movement away from that tribal favoritism, but that was an example of continuity. We also see a lot of decentralization in distant provinces under both the Rashidun and the Umayyads. Both the Rashidun and the Umayyads enforced mass migration among their subjects, So this is another thing that continued from the Rashidun Empire to the Umayyad Empire. The Umayyads maintained tax systems that the Rashidun had maintained, and the Rashidun actually put in the same tax systems that had existed before. So if it was a Byzantine area, then the taxes continued to be kind of practiced in the same way. There are also a lot of new government bureaus that were created, again, very similar to the Byzantine and Sasanian administrations. In terms of the actual takeover and in terms of the violence of that, we don't see a lot of violence in the Rashidun takeover on the part of the Muslims. So actually, in a lot of cases, when the Muslims would be coming to take over a certain city, a certain town, there was often celebration for their coming because of how horrible the previous rulers were. So in that sense, a lot of the violence was between the actual hegemons and not really among the people themselves who actually celebrated the Muslims coming in. Aside from that, the Umayyad transition was a little more violent, but largely limited to a clash between the Rashidun Caliph Ali and the Umayyad challenger Muawiyah. This did end in arbitration anyway, so that's not as violent as it definitely could have been. And then the caliphate was later fully handed over to Muawiyah by a treaty, which he didn't respect, but it was still handed over by a treaty and not necessarily by violence. In terms of new administrative practices, some of the Umayyad caliphs introduced Arabization and Islamization. This was a pretty new practice. And then on top of that, there was reorganization to make the military less tribally organized.
Hello, my name is Paige. I am a recent graduate as well. I just graduated in international relations. And the chapter that I worked on covered the Persian to Macedonian power transition. And this is kind of a unique case, and we'll get into why in a second. So similar area as the last couple, we're kind of looking at the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indus River. And the Macedonian Empire kind of started up there, see, by Greece. Okay, so in Persia, pre-transition Persia, can be characterized, their government system can be characterized as a monarchy with secondary leadership that would still be subject to the king. So the secondary leadership would include things like religious leaders and satraps. The satraps were similar to more regional kings or princes. The Zoroastrian religion was the state religion. However, the Persian Empire did actually exercise religious tolerance in general, and people were not forced to convert. Local religions were allowed to be maintained, and actually a lot of local leadership was allowed to be maintained from empires that were conquered by the Persians. However, higher up levels of government were always Persian in order to maintain stability. So satraps, always Persian. Early on in the Persian Empire, they had a policy of expansionism, and under Xerxes I, yes, the one in 300. Xerxes I had a not so successful campaign in Greece, and that resulted in a switch into a more of a consolidation policy. In that time, Persia became very stable and successful, especially economically. They were doing really, really well. With only some minor revolutions in the area, minor uprisings that were put down fairly quickly. And also the Macedonians began to grow in power and ambition and start to try to expand. However, they did not have a super well-established government system. They had not been in charge of large portions of land for very long, and so they didn't have established systems the same way that the Persians did, which comes into play later. It's very important. So the power transition happened fairly quickly, and this was in part because of Persian oversight, and also in part because of Alexander's strategic capability. As we know, pretty important dude, knew what he was doing. when Alexander takes over, he does honor a lot of the Persian traditions and especially loved Cyrus the Great. He literally, like, there's an account of him weeping at the tomb of Cyrus the Great. He loved that guy. And kind of wanted to emulate Cyrus in a lot of ways. So the Macedonians were attacked by the Persians, but there were actually no common ties or beliefs to really speak of, and so it was kind of just a case of them expanding, and the Persians happened to be there in a lot of ways. So post-transition, the government was technically a hybrid of the Persian and Macedonian leadership. The satrap system was retained, and Alexander actually married one of the Persian noblewomen, and he also encouraged some of his leadership to do the same. The issue comes up because Alexander actually, in a lot of ways, took the Persian system and almost gets rid of any traces of Macedonian culture and their government system. But again, this is partially to do with the fact that the Macedonian system was not as well established, and so he essentially just takes over the Persian system. Our conclusion was that this does not fit as well into our theory. However, it is an important example of how there can be high levels of continuity and low levels of violence for other reasons. And so we have some of those listed up here. So, yeah, that is essentially the chapter that we worked on. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Rebecca here? She was traveling. Okay, not here yet. Let me just briefly discuss a case that fits very closely to the theory, which is the transition from the United Kingdom to the United States. We have cases from all over the world, and obviously going back quite far in time. A couple of things to know is that the United States, of course, was very closely tied to British society and culture. In the United States, we tend to think of the Revolution as a clean break, but that's probably an exaggeration. Much of British law and British order was retained in the United States, and Americans tended to see the British for a long time as their heirs, or their ancestors, literally and figuratively speaking. By the 1870s, the U.S. and Britain were developing closer ties, mostly because by that point the Americans believed that the British had embraced a more full-fledged democratic form of government. And so there was still competition over the Caribbean, which eventually the British decided to withdraw from. And by the beginning of the 20th century, the British and Americans were virtual allies, eventually becoming de facto allies. Many folks, especially on the East Coast, traveled back and forth to Britain, went to school in Britain, so Americans were very familiar. Eventually, Winston Churchill was the son of an American citizen. There were a lot of very close ties. And then, of course, after Pearl Harbor, the United States and Britain, just as during World War I, were firm allies. And beginning in 1942, the Americans began to take management of the situation, shall we say. And the British were not thrilled with that at first, but they realized that the Americans had all the money, and so they sort of stepped back and made space for the Americans to take over. And then they worked together to create a post-war system, eventually culminating in the Bretton Woods Order, the United Nations, and other institutions that coalesced both British and American tradition. So the fit is high, and this is a case, by the way, that a lot of power transition scholars are spending more time with, and it correlates very nicely there. The low level of violence, of course, between the U.S. and the U.K., and then the high degree of continuity between the U.S. and the U.K. Overall, like I said at the beginning there, the vast majority of cases are relatively peaceful and have a fairly high degree of continuity. And that seems to track with some of these institutional and interpersonal, ideational, identity sorts of factors that we took a close look at. There are exceptions. One case that is very puzzling, frankly, is the Alexander the Great case, that he assimilated into the Persian way of life, much to the dismay of his leaders, which means that you can achieve those results through other means. In particular, there seems to be a question about leadership and personality. Sometimes the personality of the leaders weighs much more heavily. Another one that's a puzzling case is, frankly, World War I, that based on the model, that should not have happened, right? German and British ties were very close. You probably know that the House of Windsor has German roots, going back to King George I and so forth. So there were plenty of reasons for the Germans and the British to feel that closeness, but it went a different direction. You can perhaps attribute that to the Kaiser. I would tend to attribute it to a group of German traditionalists who were very militaristic and ended up having an outsized influence in German politics. What does this say about the case that everybody's curious about, right? The U.S. and China. Of course, there's an old joke among hegemonic transition theorists, which is that international relations scholars have predicted 11 of the last 2 power transitions. That we have a tendency to see power transitions that really aren't there. Obviously, the Soviet Union never took over leadership of the world. Instead, they disintegrated. Japan, back when I was in college, was supposed to be the next great power and was going to take over from the United States. China has assumed that role now, but I think caution is advised because a lot can happen. And as far as whether a transition from the U.S. to China will be peaceful and orderly, I think the theory points to a mix of possibilities. Obviously, the Chinese and American systems are fundamentally different, so that points to a fairly disruptive and perhaps violent transition. On the other hand, China today is not the same as China 20 years ago or China 40 years ago, so we don't know whether China will continue to change. Perhaps Chinese leaders will be more receptive to Western approaches. I find it interesting that the international economic organizations that China has been eager to create have an awful lot of Western elements to them, which makes you wonder whether perhaps they've internalized a lot of those Western principles. Ties between American and Chinese elites are not particularly deep or strong, but they do exist. Many, many Chinese students have studied in the United States. Many American businessmen have set up shop in China. So at this point, I hate to be definitive, or I hate to be ambivalent, but I think it's appropriate to say we're just not quite sure the way it's going to go. That concludes the presentation. If Rebecca shows up, perhaps we can make an exception and give her a chance to talk about her case, which is very interesting. Otherwise, we welcome questions and answers. So, thank you.
Thank you. What I'd like to do, up to the table, we're going to bring everybody into the discussion now. Let's invite you to pass that microphone around if it feels like the question is meant for you. When we do have presentations here, we really like to have a conversation associated with that. And I'm curious to hear the kinds of questions you might have. You're welcome to ask our panelists questions about their theory or their evidence or the way that they thought about their concepts. The way this will work is that we have a student in the back. Sam has a microphone. Because we are recording this, we just invite you when you do have your hand up to wait for the microphone to come to you, to stand, introduce yourself briefly, tell us your name, tell us what you're studying, and invite our panelists as well to be relatively concise as you answer so that we can get as many questions as we can in the next 15 minutes. I'm going to start, though. I'm going to ask one question. Yeah, would you like the clicker? Maybe Sam, could we get the lights on for the front so that you are all not so much in the dark? I would like to know what other theories you considered as you thought about this prevalent of peaceful transitions between great powers. Some of the ones that crossed my mind that didn't seem to be quite as specific to what you were arguing were maybe a lack of capacity on the part of a declining power to really challenge an emerging power, perhaps a high level of economic integration, maybe not political integration or historical ties so much, but economies might be intertwined. I was curious as well about the possibility of geographic distance and how that might have played into the way in which a declining power might feel threat or lack of threat or change its ability to challenge a rising power. So I'm going to start with that, and then please, as soon as you have questions, just raise your hand. We'll provide you with the microphone and invite you to stand and introduce yourself. Thank you. We'll go to 150.
Thanks, Quinn. Yeah, this is a tricky topic. Again, like I said at the beginning, there's a tendency to look at power transitions that failed as important cases, but I tried very hard to keep the whole project focused on successful power transitions and what happened during and after the transition. And so, unfortunately, some of the things that you're raising we just didn't address because they had to do more with why there was a power transition. And that, to me, is is a separate question. And we could talk about it, and in the conclusion of the book, there are a few references to whether there's something that we can learn about that. I mean, to really study all the power transitions and why they happen, you'd have to look at all the non-transitions and why they didn't happen. And that would take a lot more than 5 years and 14 students, I can say. No, we didn't look a lot at economic integration, partly because I have not found that to be a very valuable factor. That in many cases, the countries that confront each other are integrated. It doesn't seem to be a good predictor, one way or the other, of warfare. In that sense, I split from some of the neoliberal institutionalists. And at any rate, in almost all of the cases, there was a fair amount of trade going on, not at a constant level, but generally pretty high. Now, there's another variable that you could have mentioned, which is structural, right? There are all sorts of geopolitical structural factors, aside from some that you were talking about, such as whether there's a third entity over the horizon, for example. In most of the cases, as you've seen, the conflict takes place within a region, but that region is not entirely isolated, right? For example, Genghis Khan intervened in the Middle East, and so actors in the Middle East eventually had to factor in what was happening in China. Obviously, the Incas and the Aztecs discovered that there were all sorts of forces over the horizon across the ocean, which they then had to factor in for the rest of their existence. So those things can matter. Also, things that are beyond the scope of the project, such as a nuclear arms stalemate. It's possible that that will be a key factor in what happens between the U.S. and China. So yeah, there are other factors that could have been considered. Sure.
Yeah, I just have a question about measurement. in particular, just focusing on the modern case of the U.S. and China, and looking at kind of you're looking at kind of societal elite ties between the two countries, and then also kind of political institutional ties. And I guess I'd like you to kind of step me through the process of how you measure the level of ties there, because clearly there's some institutional ties where China has been accepted into U.S.-based institutions, including the World Trade Organization is a really significant part of that. On the other hand, it's not part of other elements here, military alliances, maybe not a core member in some ways, not in the IMF or the World Bank at the same level of influence. How do you parse that? How do you decide whether it's high, medium, or low in these? Because obviously it's somewhere between there. How do we decide?
Sure. So I actually break this out in the article that I've put together, and I look for the frequency of interaction, the volume of interaction, to the degree that I can. And I recognize that because we're measuring things across 3,000 or 4,000 years, that I won't be able to have very precise data, and so I've fudged that a little bit. But also the variety of interaction. So, for example, if the only thing that the two societies have in common is a common religion, then to me that's something, but it's, at most a moderate level of similarity and connection. If they also have a similar social structure, if they have a similar approach to governance, then this starts to add up, and that's measurable somewhat. Yeah, China, though, like you said, or implied there, is an interesting case because if you just look at the membership roster, it looks like China is fully integrated in the sort of Bretton Woods neoliberal arrangement, but it has done so on its own terms. It has carved out many exceptions to rules. So China's membership in the WTO looks very different from France's membership. Also, I look at the kinds of dispute settlement problems that U.S. and China have had, which are likely to get more intense rather than less over the next 4 years. And that also makes me wonder whether there's really that internalization of rules and principles. Because ultimately that, I think, is the causal mechanism, is to what degree do the elites in the rising power have respect and reverence for the principles, values, rules, practices, institutional arrangements of the declining power. And so that's, to me, if that is very high, then they will tend to want to preserve that, mostly because of their own internal preferences. So does that help?
Yeah. Just following up on that, I mean, aren't some people arguing right now that the Chinese leadership has maybe stronger support for some of the declining power's rules than the current leadership of the declining power?
Well, that's actually possible. I'm not sure I agree with that, but one of the things that was pointed out, I forget which case now, sorry, but is that in many cases the rising power presents itself to the second tier actors as a sort of restorationist society, a true believer, where they'll say the declining power was great 100 years ago, they had great principles and values, and they were true to them, but they've become corrupt. They become wishy-washy, they become uncommitted to those values. But we are going to hark back to that golden age, and we're going to bring back those values. So in some ways, yeah, we've seen that maybe in 3 or 4 cases where the rising power is actually more committed to the values than the declining power.
Hello, my name is Will Ford. I'm a student studying economics and international relations, and I just have one question. What are the actions that can be taken by the declining power? Like you mentioned that there are a lot of cases where there could have been a transition, but there wasn't. Like, for instance, World War I, World War II with Germany. What are some actions, did you guys look at like what actions can be taken by declining powers to not become declining powers, or are they just kind of acted upon, or what sort of things can they do?
I guess I'll take this one too. Students are saying, please don't make us answer. Anyway, no, we didn't look at that. People do, Charles Kupchan, a few others talk about that, and there are smart ways and dumb ways to be a declining power. One of the dumb ways, Stephen Wall is to exclude the rising power from any position of influence or status. Some people think that's why Germany ultimately started World War I, that they just didn't get the attention and the status and the prestige they thought they deserved, and probably did at some level. So yeah, you want to be at least somewhat accommodating. It depends on the nature of the rising power. If they're a truly radical revisionist state like Hitler, or Napoleon, maybe there is no room for agreement or compromise. So yeah, you have to be smart. And like I said, I think one of the imponderables of this whole process is leadership and the personality of leaders. And that is just, I think, something that international relations scholars tend to shy away from. It's not really part of our models for the most part. It's very difficult to quantify, very difficult to come up with a general model. But yeah, there are smart ways and dumb ways to decline. Sure.
Can I add something to that?
Oh, please. Yeah.
So actually, in my case, I looked at the Rashidun Empire, and they kind of came up between the Sasanian and the Byzantine empires. The Sasanian Empire did fall, but the Byzantine Empire actually didn't. They just took over a lot of land from the Byzantines, and the Byzantines survived not very powerfully for a really long time, and then actually outlasted the Rashidun, and I think maybe the Umayyad empires as well, and just kind of waited it out until they could come back stronger. So.
I thought about including the Byzantines in the study, but I could never find an endpoint that made sense. By the time the Ottomans took over Constantinople, the Byzantines were just a tiny shell of their former selves, and so, and that's more typical than not of a lot of these great powers. They just sort of fritter away or fade away. But yeah, they were never really overtaken by another empire, despite the effort.
Thank you.
Looks like I have about a minute, maybe two.
So I really liked that you guys diversified kind of what power transitions that you guys were looking into, both in like time and geographical location. But in you guys' opinion, why do you think modern literature, the current literature, is mostly focused on the modern transitions instead?
Far be it for me to ask why my colleagues are not doing it right. I mean, I don't know. International relations scholars are absolutely fixated on the period since the Peace of Westphalia, 1648 to today. I reject that, and there is a growing number of us. I think there's even a unit within the International Studies Association that calls itself Historical International Relations. And there's a book by a woman named Zara Cole that starts with Genghis Khan and argues that much of the European world that we have today actually started back in the 13th century in Mongolia. I don't see, for example, a big distinction between the way ancient peoples thought of their independence, especially the empires, Romans and Persians and so forth, and the way great powers think of their sovereignty. I just don't see a lot of gap, and so I have, for a long time now, looked at history as one big unified set of cases that are available for study, and I hope more people will see it that way.
So I think that the value of this case study actually comes from that fact that we took things going back to the ancient world up to the modern world. And while things are going to look a lot different, I think that doing things in a holistic manner allows us to pick out patterns, which I think is part of why I think with this book, I think some people might try to apply it too directly to more modern cases and have a little bit of difficulty with that because, again, we're using some like ancient examples as well. But I think the value of it comes from where we see continuity. Where do we see things that are happening over and over and over and over and over again? And if those things were happening in the ancient world and they were happening in, the classical world and throughout all of history, I don't think that in any way, as much as we are in a more globalized world, I don't think that things are going to have changed so much that suddenly that line of continuity is going to break. And so we're able to kind of glean information about what things could look like in the future as well because of that line of continuity. And so that's kind of, I think, the value in looking at it at a holistic sense. So
we're just about out of time, but I'd just like to ask each of our students, 30 seconds or less, to share one thing about how working on this project shaped your worldview.
Is someone ready?
One thing that allows you to see the world differently because you participate.
For me, I looked into some Persian spaces, and my focus in the IR major was more on Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And so seeing how the problems of humanity are pretty consistent across time and space, I think gave me more empathy for spaces that I had never really been curious about before, as well as just an appreciation for the depth and breadth of knowledge that scholarship has to offer us.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that stuck out to me most about the empires that I looked at is just the level of continuity, and it's really changed the way that I go about some of these modern cases that we've been talking about, like the UK, the US. I guess that's a little more historical, but like now with the US, China, definitely changed the way that I go about thinking about those and the way I go about kind of wrestling with the concepts and what might happen in the future based on what happened in the past.
I think for me, it affected a lot of how I look at resources because a lot of the resources the Neo-Babylonian to Persian power transition that I also did some writing on, pretty much every resource that I had available to me was something that was written as a propaganda piece. And so it was interesting basically trying to figure out truth from a very biased story. And I think that is something that's really applicable to right now as well, because we do have a lot of very biased information. We have a lot of false information. And so it was interesting looking at a historical, ancient body of work and having to do that same thing where I was having to pick through and see, okay, where are the commonalities? Where are they saying the same things? Where are they differing? Why would, Cyrus want to say this about what's going on? And why would Nebuchadnezzar want to say this about what's going on? And being able to understand motives for why people said what they did. So,
thank you very much. I'll just say one thing as we close. BYU is a unique place in many ways. But there is one particular way in which BYU is a pretty magical place to be a student that you might not know when you first come here. And that is that we are a research university that has very few graduate students to support their professors to do research. And our BYU culture is a culture where we bring undergraduate students, often even by the time that they're sophomores or juniors, into our research teams. And one of the marvelous things that you can do as a student here at BYU is work with a professor that you enjoy on a question that is really interesting to you, to solve real scholarship on really interesting questions. And we do that better than almost any other undergraduate university in the country. So I invite you as students to make that part of your BYU experience. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.